13th of October 1989. The town of Danner, Wisconsin was shaken by a seismic event unlike anything they'd ever experienced. This might have been written off as an earthquake, were it not for one disturbing factor. The ground-shaking event was accompanied by a huge spike of radioactivity, with the strange phenomenon happening a month before the Berlin Wall was torn down, during a period of the Cold War that historians call the Year of Crisis. It's easy to understand why the people of Danner immediately assumed the worst. But the huge eruption they felt wasn't the result of a nuclear bomb going off. The SCP Foundation was alerted to the event in Danner when they picked up a series of radio transmissions coming from just outside the town. When they arrived, they found something incredible, like something out of a sci-fi movie. Standing at the quake's epicenter was a creature that looked to be from another world. Standing 2 meters tall and weighing almost 300 kilograms, the being was green and brown in color, with a bulky humanoid body. Its head was a different story though, and resembled a gigantic housefly with a proboscis and huge stereoscopic eyes. Surprisingly, the strange creature did not immediately go on a rampage. Instead, the being, designated SCP-2273, appeared to be exhausted, injured, and extremely malnourished. It offered no resistance at all to the Foundation containment team, and it was taken to Site-17 without conflict. While the SCP Foundation is no stranger to visitors from other worlds, there was something especially unusual about this supposed alien invader. The doctors who examined the creature and treated its injuries found an appendage that seemed to function as an organic radio transmitter, and large open wounds on its shoulder blades and forearms where further appendages had been ripped off. Additionally, while its insect-like exoskeleton was mostly a uniform green and brown pattern, the creature's upper arms and torso were dotted with a variety of scars and markings that, on closer inspection, looked like military badges. Was this some kind of wounded intergalactic soldier who had been stranded on Earth? If it was, then how were the organic badges on this alien's exoskeleton a near-perfect match to military badges worn by soldiers in the Soviet Union, even if they did reference a unit that didn't officially exist within the Soviet Army? The scientists were sure this alien wasn't an alien at all. Underneath its exoskeleton was a non-anomalous human being. If that was true, then this was even more terrifying than an extraterrestrial visitor. The scientists were sure that the USSR had developed a new kind of organic armor, and this anomaly showing up in Wisconsin was the result of a test on US soil that had gone wrong. If that was the case, then there was no telling how many more of these exoskeletons were out there and would need to be contained. The Foundation had to act quickly and find out more. While SCP-2273 was recovering, they called in Dr. Friedrich, an on-site psychologist who could speak several languages including Russian. Dr. Friedrich would be tasked with interrogating the SCP on its origins and the nature of the suit. The interview was conducted via AM radio from a separate observation chamber, as the biological transmitter seemed to be SCP-2273's only method of communication. The interview began with Dr. Friedrich speaking to SCP-2273 in Russian, only for 2273 to respond that Dr. Friedrich's accent was atrocious and requesting he use German instead. SCP-2273, who, according to the organic military patches on his body, was named Major Alexei Belatrov, initially resisted being interviewed. He believed that he was a prisoner of war, being held by the American military. According to him, he had been in the middle of battle, and that the Americans had killed his men and left him for dead in the wilderness. Nothing that Dr. Friedrich told him, that there was no war or that the Foundation was not affiliated with the US government, could convince him otherwise, and he refused to talk further. Before a second interview was conducted, Belatrov was given an old copy of the Level 1 Researcher General Debrief as a way of helping him further understand the nature of the Foundation and his containment. Belatrov was more cooperative after that, though the realization that he would most likely be kept in containment for the rest of his life caused him great distress, and he was unwilling to speak to Dr. Friedrich for another 3 days. Dr. Friedrich didn't give up though, and when Belatrov finally opened up to the doctor, he began to tell him more and more. Belatrov told the doctor that when he was a child, Russia was hit by an American nuclear warhead, and that the Soviet Union immediately retaliated. The resulting nuclear conflict, which Belatrov called the War to End the World, caused massive devastation, and left most of the planet dangerously irradiated. That is why he had the exoskeleton. It was to shield him from the radiation and allow him to survive above ground. Unfortunately, Belatrov knew very little about how the suit was made or how it worked, saying that it was built by the engineers, and that it grew naturally over a period of several years. But Belatrov hadn't made the decision himself. It was his parents who had volunteered him as a test subject for the exoskeleton suit program when he was still young, hoping it would give him a better chance at survival. The process of bonding the exoskeleton to the human body was extremely painful, but according to Belatrov, its advantages far outweighed the pain. The suit not only helped him survive in a nuclear wasteland, but made him a better soldier. The suit allowed him to lift and carry up to 1,200 kilograms, gave him stereoscopic vision, and the organic radio transmitter allowed him to communicate with other soldiers across long distances, as well as listen in on encrypted enemy transmissions. The wounds on his shoulders and arms, where it looked like appendages had been ripped out, were where his weapons and supply packs had previously been mounted. Belatrov had been stationed with his men in the area he was discovered when they were attacked by American soldiers. The soldiers had ripped off Belatrov's weapons and supply pack, and did the same to all his men as well. They were all shot, with Belatrov being spared for the moment only because the Americans had identified him as the commanding officer. Suddenly, there was a bright flash of light, and the American soldiers vanished. Not only that, but the landscape changed. Where there had been a post-nuclear wasteland before, now there were lush green trees. Injured and disoriented, Belatrov began sending distress signals, only to have those signals intercepted by the SCP Foundation. The most interesting part of Belatrov's story, as far as the Foundation was concerned, came during his fourth interview, when Dr. Friedrich asked him about the engineers who had designed the exoskeleton suit. In Belatrov's own words, "They weren't truly known to man until the years of the Great War and the Revolution. The French found them in buried cities where the Western Allies were digging their trenches. Eventually they were made to build weapons for the war by both sides." By his description, these engineers didn't sound human, but they were by no means unknown to the SCP Foundation. Belatrov described the engineers as humanoid, nocturnal, covered in fur, and possessing technology and intelligence far beyond that of any human. Those familiar with the Foundation's history might already know the engineers by their Foundation designation of SCP-1000, or their more commonly known name, Bigfoot. A quick rundown. SCP-1000 are a species of intelligent humanoid primates that lived alongside humanity in highly advanced cities until their own technology was turned against them. Not only were their cities wiped off the face of the earth, but 70% of their population was slaughtered, and the survivors were driven mad to the point that their mental faculties were no higher than those of a chimpanzee or gorilla. The SCP Foundation is tasked with keeping them away from human contact, in fear of what the creatures would be able to do to humanity if they ever regained their memories and full mental function, and rumors have been spread about them possessing deadly anomalous properties. But evidently, the destruction of the SCP-1000 species never occurred in Belatrov's universe, or if it did, it wasn't nearly as complete. In that timeline, humanity regained contact with SCP-1000 after discovering their underground cities sometime during World War I. After this discovery, both Allied and Axis powers began recruiting them to build weapons, and their weapons played a role in both the Russian Revolution and the Second World War. It was because of these technological advantages that the Cold War escalated into what would become the war to end all wars. Both sides were armed with not only nuclear warheads, but highly advanced radiation-proof exoskeleton armor that allowed the conflict to continue even after the total destruction of the planet. While the humans fought above ground, life continued as normal for SCP-1000 in their underground cities. As Belatrov noted, they never wore the armor themselves, as they had no need to venture above ground. Only soldiers wear armor, and this is not their war. Belatrov continued to adjust to life in containment and sitting for regular interviews with Dr. Friedrich. He was given the rations provided for humanoid anomalies, but in much larger quantities, as the suit required him to eat around 8,000 calories a day to keep it functioning. Belatrov also began taking advantage of his ability to access the Foundation's library. He would often read or listen to classical music, particularly by the Russian composer Tchaikovsky. He seemed especially fond of reading The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. No surprise, given he was able to directly relate to the experience of living through an apocalypse and being transported to a strange timeline with no way to return home. But with little else to occupy his time, Belatrov began to display symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, reporting in his now regular interviews with Dr. Friedrich that he was constantly reliving memories of the battles he'd fought and the lives he had taken in combat. The suit was making the problems worse too, it seemed. It was as if he could never forget, as one of its features was an ability to store and replay memories. This feature was intended as a strategic aid that would allow commanding officers to more effectively gather and process information about their surroundings. But outside of combat, this only served to force Belatrov into reliving his most painful memories again and again. Every night as he tried to sleep, he would see the faces of his men, their weapons torn from their exoskeletons, laying in the dirt after being gunned down by the enemy. Like many veterans, Belatrov was being hit all at once with the harsh realities of war. Now that his brain wasn't solely focused on keeping him alive, it had time to process all the horrors he'd experienced. He told Dr. Friedrich, "I trained alongside these men for years before they put us back on the surface. Since we were all young children, we were brothers, and I gave them the order to surrender and got them killed. I should have died with them." While the story of SCP-2273 ends here, the story of Alexei Belatrov, SCP-2273-1 continues. In 2018, Belatrov was allowed passage to Volgograd, Russia, as part of an anomaly reintegration program. While he was unable to secure employment within the Russian government as he had hoped, he eventually was taken in by a monastery and continued to write letters to Dr. Friedrich until Friedrich's eventual death from lymphoma-related complications. There's plenty more on the monastery, the anomaly reintegration program, and what happened to Major Belatrov when he returned to Russia, but that will have to be a story for another day. The year was 1857, and the Second Opium War was raging between China and the combined forces of the English and French. It was one of the many bloody colonial wars fought over resources like tea, sugar, and the intoxicating opium poppy. It was a war fought by peasants and noblemen alike. One of these aristocratic soldiers was the noble Lord Theodore Thomas Blackwood, the quintessential English gentleman and explorer. While his fellow soldiers cowered behind cover, Lord Blackwood charged into the fray, shouldering his rifle and firing his pistol into the crowd of opposing soldiers. It was the Battle of Canton, one of the most crucial battles of the entire conflict. The French and English were laying siege to the city of Canton, also known as Guangzhou, to prove their military dominance and capture an important Chinese government official. Lord Blackwood led the charge on horseback. Every bullet seemed to find the heart of a foe. He was a true hero among men, a gentleman warrior with class, refinement, and style. And it would be thanks to his expert leadership and marksmanship on the field that the Allied European forces won the battle decisively. Lord Theodore Thomas Blackwood is a name that deserves to be counted among Lord Horatio Nelson, Sir Francis Bacon, and Sir Walter Raleigh. In addition to being a skilled and honorable fighter, Lord Blackwood is a consummate explorer, naturalist, and frontiersman. During his heyday, he traveled perhaps further than any man across the known and unknown corners of the globe. He made scientific, biological, and anthropological discoveries that should have reset the course of society forever. And yet, you won't find any records in the history books of Lord Theodore Thomas Blackwood, nor will you find any grand oil paintings or dedicated wings in British museums. This is because Lord Theodore Thomas Blackwood is a 4.5-inch telepathic neon sea slug, and he's known to the SCP Foundation as SCP-1867. While he would never admit to it, Lord Blackwood belongs to the species Nembrotha kubariana, also known as the variable neon slug. He's kept in a standard aquarium in a Foundation containment site, and is physically no different to any other member of his species. What makes Lord Blackwood unique is his powerful telepathic abilities, specifically, the power to communicate by speaking directly into people's minds. And what's more, he's extremely talkative. But to what extent is anything that this anomalous sea slug says true? Or is he just like SCP-082 Ferdinand the Cannibal, a creative and pathological liar? It isn't committed to record how exactly the Foundation discovered Lord Blackwood. Perhaps a local aquarium worker worried they were going insane when they heard the voice of a 19th century English nobleman ringing in their ears whenever they were cleaning algae out of the tank. Maybe Lord Blackwood was found by SCP Foundation divers, who are constantly combing the ocean for anomalous creatures and activity. What we do know is that Lord Blackwood is an incredibly strange and mysterious individual. He claims to have visited locations all around the world and encountered rare societies and creatures. The Foundation was skeptical about a number of Lord Blackwood's more outlandish claims, on account of him being a sea slug, but he does appear to have the knowledge to back up his supposed experience. Interviews with Lord Blackwood have shown that he's extremely knowledgeable in the areas of geography, zoology, botany, archaeology, anthropology, and linguistics relating to his claimed regions of exploration, as well as more esoteric fields such as obscure mythology, mysticism, and cryptozoology. In other words, if Lord Blackwood hadn't gone on his escapades around the globe throughout history, how would he have come to possess this wide variety of information? The Foundation was getting frustrated and began to probe further into the personal life of the most interesting gastropod in containment. Lord Blackwood, under questioning, was always polite and amicable with Foundation staff. He seemed to display no real knowledge of the fact that he himself was a sea slug, going as far to accuse other people of being crazy or drunk when they brought the fact up to him. While none of Lord Blackwood's tall tales ever extend past the year 1910, he told fanciful stories of exploring the Americas and of his involvement in the Second Opium War on the side of the English. Naturally, the Foundation wanted proof. When they pressured Lord Blackwood on this, something even stranger happened. He gave it. The Lord told his interviewers that he would happily donate his collection to them if it gave them cause to believe what he was saying. He gave the baffled Foundation researchers the address of a cottage in England where they could find the secrets to his bizarre and mysterious past, and local agents in the area followed up on the information. Upon investigation, Foundation field agents did indeed find the cottage that Lord Blackwood had specified. It was being maintained by an extremely old woman. When questioned about her presence there, she said that she was keeping the house for Lord Blackwood and gave no more useful information. Incidentally, it appears that this singular purpose was all that this old woman was living for. She abruptly passed away from heart failure 5 days after the Foundation commandeered the cottage. Whether anything truly anomalous caused this, we still do not know. At first, the cottage seemed normal, until the field agents discovered a secret basement housing Lord Blackwood's collection. They were amazed at what they saw. The basement consisted of zoological and botanical specimens, over 3,000 artifacts, a library containing over 5,000 items, and a functioning 1800s scientific laboratory. It took about 3 weeks for Foundation agents working round the clock in shifts to remove all the items from Lord Blackwood's mysterious collection, and what they found raised even more questions. The collection included, but was no means limited to, 116 unknown species of plants, 107 unknown species of insects, 28 unknown species of lizards, 23 unknown species of fish, 14 unknown species of amphibians, 12 unknown species of mammals, fossils pertaining to 8 unknown species of dinosaur, fossils pertaining to 12 unknown species of prehistoric mammal, and artifacts belonging to 29 unknown indigenous societies. That's a lot of unknowns. But wait, there's more. His collection also contained a collection of seemingly unknown firearms, including 3 wide-bore muskets marked as Dr. B.T. Moth's effective particle destabilizers, detailed globes of Mercury, Venus, Mars, and the Galilean moons, accompanied by notes detailing possible paths of surface exploration, a heavily modified carriage containing instruments of unknown purpose. A note attached to the door reads, "On the Fritz, speak with Henry," and a highly dangerous and seemingly anomalous machine that killed 4 Foundation field agents before it was destroyed on site. And when questioned about this little fiasco, Lord Blackwood responded, "I did warn you to be careful around my collection. That bloody thing nearly took my head off back in '97 when I found it." However, there was one thing recovered from Lord Blackwood's collection that was perhaps more interesting than all the others. 35 handwritten journals containing recordings of events described by Lord Blackwood in his grandiose tall tales to the Foundation researchers. The accounts are generally identical to the stories he had told, save for some slight variations and exaggerations on the part of Blackwood in the retelling. Most interestingly of all of these journals have been dated to the appropriate time period of the events described by Foundation scientists. While the stories are too numerous to all be shared here, there's one that perfectly sums them all up. Lord Blackwood's account of a possible encounter with SCP-1000, also known as Bigfoot, in Seattle during the mid-1800s. Lord Blackwood, seeking to explore the so-called New World of North America, embarked with an assistant and an indigenous American guide to the Pacific Northwest in search of the legendary Sasquatch. The trio was headed for Mount Rainier, then known as Tahoma. During the journey, Lord Blackwood found a young fox caught in a trap that had been set by a local tribe. He took sympathy on the animal and freed it, allowing it to run away to safety. That night, he and his assistant met up with the rest of his guide's tribe, and they settled down for the evening. However, things took a disastrous turn when the camp was raided by a rival tribe. Almost everyone was slaughtered in the process, and Lord Blackwood and his two companions were hauled away by the enemy tribe for a sinister purpose: sacrifice to a violent local deity. As it turns out, the creature that this tribe worshipped was the very same one Lord Blackwood and the others were trying to find, a particularly large and aggressive Sasquatch. Each night, a different sacrifice was made to the Sasquatch. The victim would be placed near a forest clearing while the tribe played a primal song, and the Sasquatch would emerge from the trees to devour its prey. The first night, it ate the assistant. The next night, it ate the guide. And then, it became time for the sacrifice of Lord Blackwood himself. As Blackwood was presented for sacrifice, he accepted his fate. But instead of the Sasquatch, a legion of woodland animals emerged from the trees. Foxes, elks, raccoons, and more, themselves painted with tribal symbols. The animals seemed to be on Lord Blackwood's side, and attacked the tribespeople who had been holding him captive, giving Blackwood the chance to flee into the forest during the chaos. Later, these same animals would find Blackwood again, and present him with things his captors had stolen from him. An elder fox also gave him a letter, proclaiming him a knight of their people now. He was allowed safe passage back to a nearby settlement, at which point he wrote to his financiers back in England, explaining the situation and asking for more money to perform further expeditions into the Tahoma region. The whole incident had only increased his thirst for adventure and exploration. Whether this tale is actually true, or just a bizarre colonial fantasy from the pathological mind of a telepathic sea slug, we may never know. But it doesn't make it any less interesting. To this day, Lord Blackwood continues to be a perplexing but fascinating anomaly. He may not be the most dangerous, and he may not be the most useful either, but there's no denying that perhaps we'd all like to sit next to his tank for a couple hours one day, and hear him spin a good yarn over a warm cup of tea.